All right, everyone, this is a recording of our population dynamics homework. Make sure you have your Power Note sheet with you. We'll be going through this PowerPoint together. Make sure you're writing down everything that is in red, and everything will be in order according to your Power Note sheet. So let's get started. We're going to be discussing something called population dynamics, and that's a really fancy way of asking and evaluating the question, how populations grow and shrink. All right, so there are a couple of different levels of organization. All right, we usually start at the lowest level of organization, all right, which is going to be the cell. All right, that's the smallest unit of life. Okay, you can either be a single cellular organism or a multicellular organism made up of one cells or many. And so those cells are going to come together to form tissues. All right, so this is how we get things like brain tissue, bone tissue, muscle tissue. It's a bunch of cells that are all doing the exact same function, coming together to be tissues. And those tissues come together to create organ systems. All right, they're going to create organ systems. Now, these organ systems are going to be different kinds of tissues working together. For example, your circulatory system involves the tissues in your heart, the tissues in your blood vessels, and the tissues in your lungs. You need all of them in order to get circulation all over your body. All right, now these organs are all going to make up an actual organ system. Okay, and then once we get those organ systems working together, now we've gotten to a multicellular organism. Okay, don't forget, we are describing multicellular organisms at that point. If you're a unicellular organism, cell is where you're at, and you have smaller little organelles or small organs inside of your cell, but you don't have tissues, organs, organ systems. We're specifically describing multicellular organisms. Now, those organisms, all right, are going to survive inside of a population. All right, a population is all organisms of the same kind living in one area. For example, if you're looking at a picture of a classroom, okay, all of the students are a population because we're all humans, we're all similar organisms, the same kind of organism. Now, we can call our actual classroom a community because we have a population of students, all right, and those students are sitting on a population of chairs and they're sitting at a population of desks, and you need all of these chairs, desks, and students working together in order to have a thriving classroom. Now, these communities, okay, when we interact with living and non-living things in this area, we consider that an ecosystem, okay? And an ecosystem is usually made up of a couple of different communities, all right? And then the biggest level of organization is something we call a biome. Now, this is a huge area, okay? So like the Everglades is a biome made up of several ecosystems. All right, if you think about the Grand Canyon, that is a biome made up of several ecosystems. All right, Booker T. Washington would be our biome, and all of our ecosystems would be the individual classrooms that you go to on a day-to-day basis, but the whole school would be the biome. Now, when we talk about population dynamics, we are specifically focusing on the organism, population, community, and ecosystem. We're going to kind of ignore the smaller stuff, what goes on inside of the organism, and we're not really going to discuss the biome because that's too big. It tends to get a little confusing when we're talking about our data. So for population dynamics, when we talk about populations growing or shrinking, we're going to talk about these four parts of our level of organization: the organism, the population, the community, and the ecosystem. Now, once we have our population, okay, we are going to be specifically studying here how populations are going to change in size due to a few things: birth rate and immigration, and death rate and emigration. Okay, and then later on in this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about limiting factors. All right, so first let's talk about birth rate. Well, it's pretty obvious. It's when people are born. Okay, usually when we talk about a rate, it's going to be the number of people born per 1,000 people, okay? And when we talk about a death rate, it's the same thing, the number of people who are dying. All right, let's talk about immigration. Now, that's when populations are going to move into an area, okay? I for immigration, I for into. We're going to move inside an area. So my parents are from Jamaica. They immigrated to America. They came into the United States. Now, emigration with an E is when you exit an area. So my parents immigrated into the US, and they emigrated with an E, emigrated from Jamaica. They exited Jamaica to enter into America. All right. Usually immigration and emigration go hand in hand. If I'm leaving an area, it's because I'm going to move into an area. And when we talk about immigration and emigration together, we're talking about migration. All right. So you can think about migration when we think of all those birds that come down to South Florida every single winter, right? Our crow population just kind of goes out of control. So they're coming from the north, they're emigrating from up north, and they're immigrating into the South or Miami area. Now, when it comes to population size, a population is going to grow or shrink. We will grow in population specifically when we have birth and immigration. More people are being born, more people are coming in, our population is going to increase. We're going to decrease our population when people die or when people leave, all right? If our population is dying or we have individuals leaving, our total population size is going to decrease. So we should be writing down this equation into our power notes, all right? Anytime we have a change in population, it's going to be because we're combining the birth rate and immigration rate, and we're going to subtract the death rate and emigration rate. My population will increase if I have more people being born and immigrating than people who are dying or emigrating. For example, if I have 10 people being born and I have 5 people who immigrated, but only 3 people died and only 1 person emigrated, okay, I'm going to have a positive number, which means my population is going to grow. But if I only have 3 people who were born and 1 person who immigrated, but I have 10 people who died and 15 people who emigrated, my number is going to be negative, which means my population is going to decrease. All right, now that we tested our knowledge on population dynamics with some graphs, all right, we're going to talk specifically about different types of growth curves. Now, what does this mean? If you take a look at the graph, okay, notice how on your y-axis we have population size and on our x-axis we have time. We are trying to see what happens to the size of our population as time increases. So looking at our exponential growth, which is on the left, obviously over time our population increases a little bit, but starts to increase by larger and larger numbers as time goes on. So we might increase by 1 or 2 people, and then after a few years we start increasing in increments of 10, and then all of a sudden we start to increase in increments of 50 and then increments of 100. And so we're consistently increasing, but we're increasing by larger and larger numbers. Then we look at the graph on the right, all right? My population starts to do the same thing that we did in the exponential curve. We start to grow, right? We're growing exponentially bigger. We're increasing, and then all of a sudden we start to increase by smaller amounts, and then we just hit this plateau. We get to this point where there's no population increase or decrease. We're just saying one specific number over time. Now, looking at these two graphs, I want you to think, which one do we think, all right, is what's really going to happen in nature? Is it natural for populations to just increase exponentially without stopping like it is on the left graph? Or do we think that populations are going to increase for a little bit and then hit some kind of wall, hit some kind of thing that's going to stop the population from growing? All right. Let's see what could potentially cause either one of these two graphs. Now we have this thing called a limiting factor, all right? So I think I kind of gave the question away at this point. Usually populations do not just grow for forever, all right? Because let's think about it. At some point, you're going to start to run out of things. Food, water, shelter. Those are the 3 main things. Now, these 3 things that we see in the bottom left corner of our screen are what we call limiting factors. Now, what is a limiting factor, all right? A limiting factor is going to be any part of the environment that restricts or limits the growth of populations. All right, so for example, food. All right, my population is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. At some point, I'm going to start to run out of food. And if I start to run out of food, my population can't keep growing because, well, not everyone is eating. So not everyone is surviving to reproduce. So my limiting factor is literally going to cause organisms to die. It's going to cause populations to stop getting so large because, well, not all of us can survive to have offspring. And these limiting factors can be something what we call biotic or abiotic, okay? Biotic is a factor that is alive, for example, food, all right? Abiotic is a limiting factor that is not alive, for example, water, okay? Limiting factors can either be alive, like food, okay? Or they can be something that is not alive, like water. All right, bio means life, so when I put an A in front of it, it means without life or no life. All right, we should have written everything down on the slide that was in red onto our Power Note sheet. You will have two little quiz questions following this, okay? We're going to test our knowledge of whether something is a biotic factor, if it's something that is alive, or if it's something that is abiotic or something that is not alive. Remember, both of these things, all of these things, can actually limit the growth of populations, or it can cause populations to start to die out, individuals within the populations to die out. All right, let's go back to those two growth curves, okay? We talked about exponential growth, all right? When we see growth like this, represented by that J shape, okay, it looks just like a J, all right? There's nothing stopping my population from growing. There is no limiting factors whatsoever, all right? Now, again, this isn't really something that organisms can naturally sustain for a very long time. So the only example we really have is something like bacteria. Okay, every time a bacterial cell divides, it creates a new bacterial cell. So we go from one bacteria, it divides in half, and now we have two. Then those two bacterium each divide in half, and now we have four. And then we go from 4 to 8, from 8 to 16, from 16 to 32, from 32 to 64, from 64 to 128, and so on and so forth. All right, and when we keep increasing over and over and over again, we get this really steep exponential curve. It's just going to look like a J, and it's going to go straight up into the air. But at some point, all of our graphs, as long as organisms are alive, are going to look like this logistic growth, because even bacteria, okay, are going to start to run out of things: food, space, okay, among other abiotic or biotic factors that can limit a population. So most of our graphs are always going to tend to look like the logistic growth curve. All right, now it kind of looks like an S, okay, so that's the easiest way to remember it. Exponential looks like a J, logistic is going to look like an S. And every single time we see an S-shaped curve, we know that there is something that is stopping the population, something that's stopping the population from growing. So at first, we have a higher birth rate than death rate. We have more immigration than emigration, all right? And so our population is growing, okay? We see that start to rise. We're getting higher in our population size. And all of a sudden, we start to run out of some really important resources. Let's say food or water. Now all of a sudden my population is going to start to hold steady at a very specific number that we call carrying capacity. All right, now most organisms again are going to show this logistic curve because we're all going to grow, but then at some point we're going to start to run out of food and our population is just going to stay exactly the same, okay? It's going to stay the same at that carrying capacity. All right? So let's specifically talk about carrying capacity, okay? It's going to be the point in which a ecosystem can no longer support, all right, no longer support any more organisms, all right? So if I only have 15 bags of Skittles and each student needs at least one bag of Skittles to survive, at some point I'm going to run out of bags of Skittles and my student population cannot go over 15 because I only have 15 bags. All right, I only have 15 bags, so I can only have 15 students. All right, so now with logistic growth, we see that populations are going to grow rapidly because they have enough resources. All right, we got enough resources. Everyone can grow. We can do our thing. We can keep having organisms. We have offspring. Everything is good. It's great. We're doing well. Then all of a sudden, growth rate is going to start to slow down because, well, we're starting to use up those resources. They're starting to become limited. All right, we're running out of food. We're running out of space. We're running out of water. And so then my population starts to slow down, and all of a sudden we reach this carrying capacity. Right? Over time, we're going to always hit carrying capacity because at some point we're going to have just enough resources, all right, to support a specific population, all right, a specific number of organisms, all right. And at that point, the environment is going to push back, all right. I can only do so much as Mother Earth. I can only feed so many organisms in this ecosystem. If you go over this number, I can no longer support you. I cannot carry you all the way until adulthood for you to have children. So the population has to stop here. Everyone else who's born above this line is probably going to die. Okay, it's probably going to die. So carrying capacity is often not exactly a straight line, okay? Usually what ends up happening is the population just grows. We overshoot. We go way too high above the carrying capacity, and then we have a dramatic decrease, okay? A lot of organisms just start to die because, well, we ran out of things that are really important, like water. If you drink all the water, organisms that are very sick, young, old, start to die off really, really fast. And then we dip under that carrying capacity, and well, water starts to reappear again because, you know, rain, and it starts to replenish itself. So then the population slowly starts to grow, and well, it goes over that carrying capacity again. So then we have another decrease in population because people are dying because there's no more water. And it's going to kind of just go up and down around that carrying capacity line. All right. So let's get specific with our limiting factors, all right? We said limiting factors can be anything that's alive or not alive, and the point of a limiting factor is something that's going to stop the population from growing. So we have two types, all right? The first is something that is called a density-dependent factor, okay? This is a factor that exists because of competition, all right? So when we talk about a density-dependent limiting factor, this is something that's going to have a big effect if your population is really, really big. But it's not going to have so much of an effect if the population is very small. For example, let's go back to our 15 Skittles example. Your teacher only has 15 Skittles, right? So as students start to walk through the door, we're good to go. I got one bag for every student who comes in. But if I have a class of 25 students, it's going to have a pretty big impact that I only have 15 bags of Skittles. Well, only 15 out of these 25 students are going to survive. But if I have a small class of 10 students, well, then I can be pretty sure that all 10 of those students are going to survive to reproduce. All right. So anytime we talk about something that is density dependent, it's going to have a big impact when the population is big, and it's going to have not so much of an impact when the population is small. All right, so some examples of density-dependent factors: food, big one, okay? Predation. If there is a huge amount of wolves but a very small amount of rabbits, well, some wolves are going to die, all right? Parasitism and disease. If we are all packed into a classroom like sardines, okay, the population is really, really big, the chances of all of us getting the flu if one person is sick is pretty high. But if we're spread out in the classroom because there are only 10 of us but there are 20-something seats, just because one person is sick doesn't mean we'll actually be in contact with them in order to get the flu, all right? So let's move on to the other type of limiting factor. We call those density independent. For these types of factors, the amount of organisms who live in an ecosystem doesn't matter. So let's go back to our classroom situation with Skittles. I have 10 students sitting in this room. And I, as a teacher, have enough Skittles for every single student, and then I actually have some extras for some students to get 2 bags. But all of a sudden, a hurricane comes ripping through the school, and we all die. It didn't matter that we had enough resources. This particular limiting factor, weather, killed everybody. It decreased the population even though we had enough resources. So these density independent factors, okay, these are things that are going to affect our population even if there are enough resources, okay? The population size does not matter. It's going to cause some kind of decline in population. So things like natural disasters, fires, floods, hurricanes, all right? Environmental changes, the ocean getting more acidic, okay? Global warming, the earth getting hotter. All right, human activities, okay, we are big independent factors, okay? Let's think about our big question. The whales can have all of the krill that they need to survive, but if we keep killing them, well, the whale population is just going to decrease no matter what, All right, you have 2 quiz questions after this asking you to identify density dependent and density independent factors, and then we'll continue with the PowerPoint presentation. All right, so let's end our conversation with predator-prey relationships, okay? So predators are obviously a biotic limiting factor, okay? They are one that is density dependent because the more food available or the more prey available is the more predators you're going to have. Now, if we look at this graph, okay, the hares, which is a type of rabbit, are going to be the blue line, and the lynx, which is a type of small predatory cat, all right, is going to be the red, purple, magenta line, okay? So if you look at the picture, the hare is the white bunny looking thing, the lynx is the cat that's behind it. All right, now something to notice about these 2 lines, okay? A trend I want you guys to notice. Look at the hairline, okay, that blue one. Notice that as the hare population increases, okay, look at 1855, the hare population is pretty high, right? We're around 80,000 hares. Look what starts to happen to the lynx population in 1855, okay? They dropped pretty dramatically, but then their numbers slowly start to increase, okay? So now as their numbers slowly start to increase in between 1855 and 1865, probably somewhere around 1860, notice what happens to the hare population. The hare population starts to dramatically decrease. Now, let's think about what's happening. The amount of lynxes, okay, are increasing, which means there are more predators. So they're going to be eating more prey, which means that our prey population, the snowshoe hare, is going to start to decrease. All right. Now, once the hare population starts to decrease, look what starts to happen to the predator population. It also starts to decrease because, again, this is a density dependent factor. They're running out of food. Because there are less hares, there are less lynxes surviving to produce offspring. All right, and if you notice, the cycle is going to continue. Whenever the hare population increases, so will the predator population of lynxes. Whenever the prey population decreases, so will that predator population as well. All right, as one goes up, okay, the other is going to also start to go up, and then it's going to start to go down, and so is the other one. All right, now think about it. There should always be more prey than predators. All right, I want you guys to think about why, because I'm going to ask you in class tomorrow. Why, all right, should there always be more prey than predators? All right, the last thing we're going to cover before your very last quiz in this PowerPoint is something called an invasive species. Now, an invasive species is something that does not belong or is not native to the area. For example, pythons. Pythons are becoming a big problem in the Florida Everglades because, well, they don't belong here. All right, people are buying these snakes as pets, and when they start to get really large, as pythons do, people start to realize they actually can't hold on to an 18-foot snake in their home, and so they think they're doing something really humanitarian, and they're going out to the Everglades and releasing them into the wild to be free. Well, pythons not only don't belong in our ecosystem, but they don't have any native predators. So they're apex predators, all right? And so what ends up happening is these pythons start to prey on species, okay, that wouldn't have been preyed upon by a python. And it's not like the alligators are eating any less. The alligators are still eating the same amount they always did. And so instead of this really balanced predator-prey cycle that we just saw in the last slide, we end up having prey populations decrease very dramatically, and it's hard for them to increase because, well, they're being preyed upon by a whole extra organism that the ecosystem never really accounted for. All right, so the effects that they tend to have on the environment are not good. They tend to prey on native species. They tend to outcompete native species for food or other resources. So think of the python versus the alligator, okay? It's competing with that alligator, and often the python outcompetes the alligator because it doesn't belong here. There's nothing preventing it from eating and doing its thing, all right? And it also can sometimes prevent native species from reproducing, or it can kill the young of native species. These guys can definitely eat baby alligators pollinators with no problem. A type of offspring that usually gets by with little to no bother will be very bothered by these pythons. So the very last quiz question is going to be asking you about the limiting factors that non-native or invasive species present. One thing I will say about non-native species, they always occur because of human activity. All right, something humans did introduced this invasive species into an environment. Okay, in our example, people are releasing pythons into the area. Okay, so go ahead and take that last quiz question. Make sure you've written down anything that was written in red. If you missed something, go back, review through the PowerPoint one more time. We'll see you guys in class the next time we see you.